dopamine overload is what we see at our neuroscience research lab to be the root cause of modern suffering. Based on our data, quite sadly, 50% of you guys here today may be struggling in some way in your mind. In our research, we've discovered that a key reason this is happening is as a result of something called evolutionary mismatch. You see, we as humans spent 300,000 years living like this dude on the left-hand side. And we've spent about 30 years moving indoors into this lifestyle where we sit down all day and stare at screens. And for our brain chemistry, after 99.9% of human evolution being spent out there, this is pretty confusing. You see, if we were to actually look at these different brain chemicals, we have things like dopamine, we also have oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. These chemicals were built for a different experience of life. Dopamine was a chemical that we had to earn. We had to get out there and hunt for food, forage, build shelters, and earn the experience of pleasure. We had deep oxytocin as a result of the connection we had with the magical tribes that we had to live with in order to survive. Our serotonin was governed by the natural food and the general natural way in which humans lived. And then our endorphins were constantly activated by the physical nature of being a human. Now, if I was to take a sample of our ancestors and then bring them into the world that we all live in today, things would get a little bit confusing for our brain chemistry as we adopt the modern pleasure of the sugar, the phones, the indoor screen-based lifestyle. These chemicals would begin to reduce. And at our research lab, all we're trying to do is help society deeply understand that a huge proportion of the challenges that we're facing in our mind today are directly attributable to the brain chemical balance challenge that we face. Now, the great news about knowing this is we can then fix it. You don't have to go and live like a hunter-gatherer again. You could do that as AI gets more and more crazy, but you could also just adopt specific habits into your life that would enable these chemicals to rebalance. This transformation that we take people through is then what we call the dose effect. Unbelievably conveniently, the four chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, happen to spell the word dose. And at this point, I'm going to introduce you to the world that we all now currently live in, dopamine land. We have become obsessed with dopamine as a species. And I really don't stand here today as some kind of healthy neuroscientist thinking, oh, everyone should be healthy like me. I grew up as the biggest dopamine addict I'd ever met of all the different friends I ever spent my time with. I had an iPhone from 11 years old, social media, super young, and just spent 10 or 15 years of my life stuck, completely obsessed with pleasure, basically only feeling good and truly relaxed if some kind of dopamine stimulation was coming into my brain. I wanted to figure out how to get out of that. There's this term now called brain rot. Brain rot is the slow destruction of our ability to focus, feel, and connect, caused by the overstimulation of modern life. So we're going to have a little look as to whether you might be living in this beautiful land, dopamine land. If your day looks anything like this, where you wake up, grab the wonderful rectangle and begin your wake-up scroll. At that point, you get hit with some negative news that the world is coming to an end. A beautiful start for the human brain. As your day begins, podcasts and music and sound has to begin to be played because your mind has become quite uncomfortable to actually listen to. So the constant audio must always be occurring and the headphones go in. Throughout the day, exhaustion, of course, sets in, and coffee has to be a key resource to keep the brain alive. The day finally begins to come to a close, and we sit down on the sofa and think, just what I need after 10 hours on a screen is one screen in front of me and one in my hand. And then finally, we muster the courage to brush our teeth after our double screening session, get into bed and think, oh, I know, I just need one more session on this beautiful device. This is where we found ourselves as modern humans, and this is where I spent like a decade of my life. And we really are, as humans, living in almost a prison of dopamine now, a metaphorical prison whereby we are stuck, consumed by pleasure. This double screening thing, for example, is very significant. You may have seen that Amazon Prime and Netflix have this new directive where they're actually dumbing down the content they're creating so people can follow storylines whilst having a phone in their hand. And Matt Damon was sharing recently that actors are being trained to actually say what they're doing as they're doing it, like, I'm getting in a car, I'm having a shower. So people could somewhat hear the storyline whilst they continue to doom scroll their feed that never seems to quite fill us up. To put into some context here, the global average phone checks are now 207 times a day. That seems quite a lot, and you can check this in your own devices. Maybe you're higher or maybe you're lower. And this is a number that is unbelievably important for us to get down. The interesting thing about our brain chemistry is dopamine is evolutionarily designed to never fill us up. And what I mean by that is when our ancestors were evolving, they were making their fires, building their shelters, creating their tools, it never felt like enough. So they always wanted better fires and better shelters and better tools. And that's why in your life, you very rarely will finish one of your 500 doom scrolls of this month. You'll very rarely finish your doom scroll and think, what a beautiful scroll. I'm so satisfied by that scroll. I really loved it. I'll put my phone down now and I feel great. Like the opposite occurs. Dopamine doesn't fill us up. At this point, I really want you to understand this very unique and powerful component of your brain. This is the home of your willpower. This is your anterior mid cingulate cortex, this small center you see there. Now, if you do post-mortem research on people that live past 100 years old, they've began to discover that their AMCC, their anterior mid-cingulate cortex, is actually larger, meaning for some reason throughout their life, they seem to have engaged willpower more often, so this component of their brain has got stronger. Now, if we were to think of the definition of willpower as the ability to resist short-term temptation to achieve some kind of long-term goal, that is something that is imperative to our brain chemistry and our mental state as modern humans. Say, for example, tomorrow morning, you wake up, still living in dopamine land, your phone stares at you, and you start to think, oh, I could go on there, but there was that brain guy that says it's a bad idea, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. In that moment, should you successfully resist the temptation, your AMCC will light up and it will activate. And with every moment of resistance, it strengthens over time. Modern humans are experiencing their AMCCs physically reducing in size because, of course, we give in to temptation a lot. We sit at our desk working, our brain tells us to work, but the phone just stares at us. And no matter how much we try, we seem to just think, I just go for the phone. I just keep going for the phone. The interesting thing here is, whilst the phone and digital dopamine is creating the challenge, your phone is actually offering this magical device that could actually be a phenomenal training aid for your AMCC. You see, if you are at the average 200 checks a day, and over the next 72 hours, you manage to cut it in half and reduce it to, say, 107 checks a day, that would actually be 100 reps for your AMCC per day. And you see, the stronger your AMCC gets, the more willpower you have for all aspects of your life, for eating the healthy food, for getting yourself to go and do the exercise, the willpower you may need with your children, whatever it may be. We want a strong AMCC, and I want you to start using this as a mantra in your mind. You see the phone, you feel the pull towards it, but you're going to think, no, AMCC, I'm going to resist the temptation. The fascinating thing about this, a life with less time inside dopamine land, is in this absence of stimulation, you begin to regain access to this magical place called your default mode network. This is a specific collection of areas in your brain that enable you to daydream, to have an imagination, and to experience the now somewhat averse state of boredom. But our default mode network is incredibly powerful. If in research you intentionally put someone into a default mode network state, meaning, for example, you get them to walk in a forest slowly with no phone, no notifications, no stimulation, just wandering along, allowing their brain to daydream, something really fascinating begins to happen. You see, boredom actually creates a state called self-projection, where your brain begins to strategize how to access the future of your dreams. What I mean by this is when you're in these states, when your brain begins to wander in the quiet, your attention begins to rebuild, and you begin to ask yourself more meaningful questions about your values and who you actually are as a person. And this is really, really important for us because we are so lost as modern humans in the constant stimulation that we're forgetting to ask ourselves the more meaningful questions in our lives that can actually enhance our life. You put someone into the quiet and they begin to ask themselves questions about their relationships and their relationship with food or alcohol or their phone or a project or a business they want to build. And for me, as someone that grew up with huge amounts of screen time, the idea of getting into a natural environment with no phone in my pocket and no podcast playing was literally terrifying. The idea of just like 60 minutes of my mind berating me with all my problems, that didn't sound like a particularly blissful experience, but it was. And it's the only reason I stand here today, because in the quiet, I did have to navigate some of the more challenging thoughts about how I was living my life, how my relationships were going. But in the quiet, I found the answers that have led me to the most magical experience of my life today. If we were to think of one activity for you to leave here with that could activate all four of our dose chemicals, it could de-stimulate our dopamine, reconnect us with ourselves for our oxytocin, restore our energy for our serotonin, and de-stress our mind. It is the simplest solution that is being lost to this addiction to stimulation, and it is very simply the headphone-free walk. You see, humans need this. We need time with our own mind, with no phone in our pocket. From a safety perspective, a phone could come with you in a bag, but you really, really will benefit from once a week, a period of time where you just wander with your own thoughts, allowing your brain to naturally ask itself the more meaningful questions and have the blissful opportunity to escape dopamine land. Thank you so much.